Hello, welcome to yesterday's Airlines. It's time for another fleet video, and in this video I'm going to be looking at my fleet of Delta Airlines aircraft. Nowadays Delta is an enormous airline and has been one of the most successful carriers probably of the last 30-40 years without a shadow of a doubt. But during the regulated era, Delta was a lot smaller and in fact was not one of the big four trunk airlines and was probably one of the smallest, down there with Continental at the bottom. And that means my Delta fleet isn't as large as some of my other carriers in this part of the collection, but as you can see, it still takes up a decent amount of space, as Delta has operated quite a varied fleet over the years. So you can see here that, we just hit the quick overview, we start obviously with the props, through the early jets, and into the classic widget scheme, which everyone loves so much. Moving to the 90s and finishing up with the Ron Allen Landau scheme, which nobody's particularly fond of. So that's a quick overview of the fleet. As with my other fleet videos, I will now take a closer look at the Delta aircraft in my fleet. So stay tuned for that. Let's get going. So as in my other videos, I will start with the oldest portion of the fleet in terms of decade, and that means that we are starting with the piston prop liners. Now, as I said, Delta was one of the smallest of the regulated trunk airlines, but unlike many of the 400 scale aircraft in my fleet, that does mean that they have lucked out and actually have a version of one of their fleet from the 1940s, which is this Delta DC-3/C-47 here, which is operated in a scheme which I call the Flying Delta. You can see the logo, the original Delta logo down at the bottom on the back of the aeroplane, and it is a triangle, a Delta with wings. And this scheme was worn from about 1940 to 1948. After that, Delta moved to a scheme which is known really, I think, as the Flying D. And I don't have any silver versions of that. They wore silver tops to at least 1951, as most US airlines did, and then started painting the fuselage tops in white. And you can see that behind here we've got a selection of prop liners wearing this Flying D scheme. So we'll start over on the left-hand side, where there are a couple of Convairs, as you can see, one of which on the left is operating in the colours of Delta CNS. In 1953, Delta took over Chicago and Southern Airlines, which at the time was about the same size as Delta. So rather than amalgamating the entire carrier and absorbing it, they actually changed their name for a couple of years to be Delta CNS. That only lasted until 1955, and after that they reverted just to be called Delta. Behind that is an early Constellation. Delta operated a small number of early Connies. And moving across, we then have a DC-6. And all the models we've looked at so far, this is the first one that's not made by Aero Classics. That's a geminijets DC-6. Moving forward, there's another DC-6. This one's by Aero Classics, and this one's wearing the Delta CNS scheme again. And Delta operated its own fleet of freighters from early on, and here's a Curtiss C-46 Commando. Moving back towards the front, then we have a standard colours DC-6, again Aero Classics. And to the right, as Delta began to mature, it picked up more modern piston prop liners, and here is a DC-7, which is wearing the Golden Crown version of this scheme, which was introduced in '54 when Delta began operating Golden Crown service with their DC-7s. Now, as with everyone else, Delta was keen on jets, but it avoided jet props and did not angle for the Lockheed Electra, unlike Eastern and National, two of its major competitors. Instead, it went straight for jets, and the DC-8 was its choice. And here is a lovely Delta DC-8 in the delivery colours. And this marked a period where Delta started introducing aircraft-specific liveries. So this one was introduced in '59 when Delta picked up its first DC-8, and its DC-8 service was called Royal Jet Service. Delta also ordered the smaller Convair 880, and you can see that operated in its own livery as well. And that was called the Aristocrat of the Jets. You can see there's like a little crown above the 880 logo. Now Delta did introduce its first version of the widget scheme when its first DC-850s were introduced, and that version had the full titles Delta Airlines, and that was introduced in 1962 and is worn here, as you can see, by one of their Delta Fanjet DC-8s. You see the little titles under Delta on the tail. Having turbofan engines at the time was a thing, as opposed to turbojets. Moving forward, that scheme was also worn later by its stretch DC-8s, and here's an early 61. And the last of the unique schemes that Delta operated was for their DC-9s, and you can see here the widget is turned on its side, and this is typically called the rocket widget scheme, and that was worn by its DC-9s from 1965 until 1968, when the airline standardized on a single livery, a version of the original widget. Now behind that you can see a geminijets Lockheed Hercules. Delta replaced its Commandos with Hercules, and this is by geminijets. And then behind that you can see the standard widget livery with shortened tiles on another DC-850, and this time that became the standard scheme with the shorter titles just saying Delta. Okay, that's the first portion of the fleet. I will now skip across to the other side of the cabinet. Stay tuned. Okay, moving on. The cabinet doesn't fully open, it's a little bit annoying, so this Convair 880 is behind glass still, but you can see that the rest of the fleet began to be repainted into the standard Delta scheme, including that Convair 880, and behind it this DC-861 with the short Delta titles, and that's a geminijets model. And then into the early 70s, as Delta absorbed Northeast Airlines, it picked up for a short time their fleet of FH227s and also its first Boeing 727s. Delta was one of the few airlines that held off ordering 727s in the 60s, but it picked up Northeast's fleet of Series 100s and 200s. And this aircraft is painted in the 1976 bicentennial colours. You can see they've got this special widget scheme going on at the front. Delta's DC-9s were also repainted in the standard colours without the rocket widget. And behind that you can see it's Gemini 727-200 also wearing the bicentennial scheme. Now Delta was quite unusual in that it operated all three of the major wide-body variants available at the time. So it ordered 747s, they didn't stay in service very long, completely oversized for their route network that Delta had. It also ordered DC-10s, but these were purely as a backup for its favoured aircraft, the Lockheed TriStar. The TriStar was obviously delayed, had all these engine problems, but did get into service and became the mainstay of the fleet, and the 10s were flipped on. And this is a beautiful TriStar by ngmodels. Delta by the 70s was getting rid of its DC-8s, except for the stretch 61s, which were re-engined in the early 80s and became Series 70s, as this geminijets example shows. Delta was also keen on the new wide bodies coming on the market and acquired 767-200s. Here we've got one in the standard colours on the right, and on the left we've got the special Spirit of Delta, which was acquired by Delta employees. And behind we've got a classic old Gemini TriStar, still a nice model. Okay, so I'll move now back up to the other side of the cabinet and to the rest of the 80s fleet. So, as you may have noticed, in the 70s, the majority of Delta's fleet wore the widget colours without the cheek line moving onto the nose, except for the TriStars. And that became, or that version, the TriStar version, became the standard livery as the 80s progressed. It was worn by their 757s, of which this is a beautiful ngmodels release. It was worn by the TriStar 500s that they picked up second hand as they began to expand internationally. There's another ngmodels version behind. It was also moved on to older types like the DC-9. Behind that DC-9 you've got McDonnell Douglas's last great hope for staying in the long haul business, the MD-11, an aircraft which never really met its performance goals, but Delta carried on using them well beyond American Airlines. And at this point again I have to switch to the other side of the cabinet. So bear with me. Okay, now moving into the late 80s and the 90s, Delta began to pick up a fleet of McDonnell Douglas MD-88s. This is a geminijets version, and behind that, when it acquired a good chunk of Pan Am's network, it also picked up a substantial number of their Airbus A310s and took delivery of some of its own. And here's an A310-300 by Aero Classics. Earlier in the 80s, Delta had been one of the latest, or one of the later airlines to acquire 737-200s. And it only ever acquired a very small number of 300s, and that was via the Western merger. Firmly into the 90s now, and you can see behind we've got the Spirit of Delta colours for the Atlanta 96 Olympics. That's a Gemini model. And as regional airlines began to come firmly tied up, they began to take on colours of the main line, and here's an Atlantic Southeast ATR 72 by Gemini. The last widget livery I have here is on the MD-90, not a successful type, but Delta has obviously acquired a lot on the seconds market, didn't acquire that many new. And then in 1997, change of leadership at Delta and a new livery, the Ron Allen colours, which were thoroughly underwhelming for me at the time, and I still don't love them, but they're okay. Here you can see them being worn by an ngmodels 757, a Gemini 767-300. Delta began to renew its long-haul fleet, replacing TriStars with 767s, and a little bit out of time, a 737-800, that's by Dragon, and moving over, the last models in the fleet are a pair of 767s and another ASA ATR. The 767 in the background is, of course, a Series 400, that's up by Dragon Wings, and that really takes us up to the turn of the century, or just after it, which is where my collection kind of fizzles out for American aircraft. So I don't have any Delta Airlines aircraft wearing the Delta Flot scheme, or the Wavy Gravy, as it was called also. I have a big fleet of widgets and a few landers, and of course the schemes earlier on. So that is a look through my Delta Airlines fleet from the 1940s up to about 2000 or 2001 or so. I hope you've enjoyed the video. As always, check out my channel, subscribe if you like it. Check out the website, yesterdaysairlines.com. Catch me on Instagram and Facebook at yesterdairlines. Tons more of this kind of content. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. See you later, guys. Bye.